The debt collector opens up with French, a classically trained martial artist who traditionally teaches the art at his gym. He is approached one day by a bunch of mobsters who try to convince him that his method is obsolete since it cannot earn him a profit. Since all they are interested in is the space French uses for his classes, he is threatened with a diminishing value for the lease if he doesn't make a quick decision. Uninterested in making deals and confident about his skills, French challenges them to a duel instead and promises to move out immediately if they can beat him. He then proves his immaculate skills by promptly launching an attack, taking on the three of them simultaneously. He eventually overpowers them and keeps his space quite easily. His troubles are far from over, however, since he is actually desperate to keep the gym running. Meeting Alex a while later, French admits that not only has the gym's insurance expired, but the $10,000 lease he was offered earlier would have been insufficient to cover any of the pending expenses. As a mob enforcer himself, Alex suggests introducing French to his boss, Tommy. Grateful for any opportunity to make some money, French thanks his friend before heading home later that evening. When his landlord visits him and demands the outstanding rent, French requests for another week to gather the cash. The next day, he meets Tommy Kowalski and accepts being a debt collector for him. Promising French to pair him up with one of his best, Tommy asks him to dress suitably for the weekend, as that is when his training will begin. On Friday morning, French meets his partner Sue and they look through the list of debtors they have to tackle for Tommy. Letting French drive, Sue gets them some coffee and ice cream before heading to the residence of their first target. With Oliver Waldstein owing $17,500 to Tommy, the two debt collectors walk up to the house hoping for a smooth transaction. What they get instead is a lot of scrambling on the other side of the door, where Oliver and his friend Clive ask Krista to buy them some time as they attempt to get away. French chases behind them till Clive suddenly shoots at him. He then grabs the opportunity to ambush Clive just as Sue crashes into him with his car. Instructed to pursue Oliver then, French gets to him in time while he tries to get away in a car. Once he crashes into another parked vehicle, he is dragged out in his injured state. After issuing a warning to Oliver in the form of a well-aimed punch, Sue asks French to drive them to the next name on their list. Arriving at Harvey's Auto and Finance a while later, Sue mentions Harvey having somewhat of a gambling problem, which has got him in trouble worth $100,000 with Tommy. He also adds that two other collectors working for Tommy were unsuccessful in collecting the debt the last time they paid Harvey a visit. This is why Sue explains the stakes are higher now if they pull it off successfully. However, they soon find out why this is a difficult task, as French is soon made to fight a gangster attempting to stall for time while Sue manages to subdue Harvey. When another gangster joins the fight, French gets thrown around a bit but continues to hold his own until Sue eventually offers a little help. Harvey then tries to offer a deal on the side to avoid Tommy altogether, but Sue and French choose to decline. Instead, they smash his kneecaps as required by Tommy before taking their leave. Making a small detour on their way ahead, the two stop by a video store where Sue picks up a movie poster. When he shows it to French, he immediately recognizes his new partner on it. As he enjoys making fun of Sue's ninja movie, he forgets his frustration at the ordeal he has been through since the morning. They soon arrive at the residence of Gordon Kerp, who owes Tommy $40,000. As has become tradition between the two of them already, French keeps the guy at the door, Mano, occupied in an intense fight which leaves Sue free to get through to find Gordon. Once he knocks the big fellow out, French joins Sue inside where Gordon fearlessly announces that he is friendly with Tommy. Once he realizes that Sue and French work for the same Tommy, however, he then informs them to return at noon the next day to collect the full amount that is owed. Unwilling to play games, Sue informs Gordon that his only option in the situation is to let French accompany him to the safe and hand over the money to him while he keeps his wife Angelica company. Heading to the basement, Gordon attempts to negotiate a deal with French, which he completely disregards in favor of the money that Tommy is owed. Meanwhile, Sue finds out that Mano isn't the family's bodyguard, but Angelica's lover instead. On the other hand, finally getting the safe out, Gordon then looks for its key and hands it over to French. Seeing more than enough money in there makes French wonder why Gordon chose to waste everybody's time instead of simply paying up. Grabbing the correct amount, French soon joins Sue outside and asks him why people behave the way they do if they have enough money to be a loan shark themselves. Equally intrigued, Sue mentions a similar incident in the past where the guy had enough money but didn't give it up until his kid's life was in danger. Making their way ahead, they soon come across Mano and a few others looking to pick a fight. While they do not really need to engage with the thugs, Sue quickly arms himself while reminding French to look out for him. Opting to take on Mano himself, Sue lets French tackle the others. Utilizing all his boxing expertise, Sue eventually defeats Mano and joins French in taking down the last of his opponents as well. Realizing that they indeed work well as a team, they then get on their way and grab some lunch. Having faced more than enough of a tough day together, Sue decides to call it a day and continue the rest of their list the next morning. While an exhausted French gets home, Sue spends some time with his girlfriend Lola. Asking him to stay careful, she tells him about Barbosa inquiring about him earlier that day. The next morning finds Sue and French at Tommy's club to submit the money they collected. Congratulating them on their good work, Tommy informs them that Harvey has already paid all the money he owed. This leads to him suggesting another gig for this newly made team just as Alex gets there. Happy to see that French has joined the group, Alex's clipped conversation with Sue reveals a rough history between them. Once he leaves, Tommy accompanies Sue and French on their way to the next gig he has for them. Appreciating French's efforts the previous day and looking forward to his potential in the future, Tommy leads them to their destination, introducing Sue and French to Barbosa, the same guy that Lola warned Sue to stay away from. Tommy then asks about the gig he had mentioned. Intending to make an example out of one of his corrupt managers, Barbosa says that he would like their help in getting the job done. Insisting that this is a personal problem that he needs taken care of urgently, he then pays the advance to Tommy and hands over the details of Connor Mulligan, their target. On their way over, Sue and French discuss how Barbosa did not hesitate to agree to a hefty fee just to get Connor beaten up. Getting to Connor's club a while later, they walk in despite it being closed for the day. When the manager there rudely questions their presence, Sue bashes him till he calls out for the bodyguard, Joey. Surprisingly, Joey recognizes Sue and decides not to get involved with him but chooses to tackle French instead. While French gets thrown around the club, Sue speaks to the manager to get some information about Connor. The manager lets him know that Connor quit the club a month ago because of the trouble he got into with Barbosa. All he knows about Connor now is that he moved in with a barman of the club. Meanwhile, French finally gains the upper hand in his ongoing fight with Joey and relentlessly attacks him. He then joins Sue in threatening the manager for more details when they are pointed in the direction of Tim, who used to be Connor's roommate earlier. Landing another punch on Joey on his way out, French then accompanies Sue to Tim's residence. Forcing his way inside the house, French takes charge and begins questioning Tim about Connor. With a little violent prodding from Sue, Tim admits that Connor doesn't live with him anymore. When Tim realizes that the debt collectors looking for Connor must have been sent by Barbosa, he states his belief that Connor isn't a thief. Showing them a picture of Connor with his baby, Tim insists that it is Barbosa who is at fault here. Unwilling to listen to his spiel, however, French compels Tim to give them Connor's latest address where he recently moved in with Sandy. On their way to Sandy's address a while later, French and Sue continue their good-natured bickering before Sue advises his new partner on better ways to forcefully enter an establishment. Immediately putting it to good use once they reach their destination, French headbutts his way in before Sue knocks the poor guy out. Coming across Sandy then, Sue demands to know anything she can tell them about Connor. Rebellious and stubborn, Sandy chooses to make matters difficult for herself by not cooperating. Instead, she insists that Connor is indeed a good man and that Barbosa's fiancée, Amanda, is the one causing all the trouble for everyone. Admitting to not knowing Connor's whereabouts, Sandy adds that if anyone had to know where he is, it has to be Amanda. Taking their leave soon after, Sue asks French to leave his principals behind and reminds him that they are getting paid by Barbosa to find Connor. Knowing how dangerous he can be when things are unfavorable, Sue insists that they have to get their hands on Connor irrespective of how great he may or may not be. Back home that evening, French mulls things over by himself before meeting Sue again the next morning. While they wait for Amanda outside Barbosa's residence, the two bond over life experiences. On the one hand, Sue learns that French is already questioning his life choices after 2 days on the job, while on the other hand, French realizes that Sue once used to be married. He says that losing Millie, his 6-year-old daughter, to leukemia ultimately resulted in his marriage falling apart as well. They spot Amanda leaving the house just then and promptly follow her through town as she runs some errands and meets a friend later. They eventually confront her while an infuriated Amanda walks back to her car after Connor supposedly refuses to see her. With no intentions of listening to Sue's advice to stay away from Connor and be with her fiancé, Amanda praises their tracking skills before telling them the right apartment number. Finally getting to Connor, the debt collectors are taken aback when he seems scared about the location of their encounter. They soon realize that he was trying to keep his young daughter Laney away from the situation, but concern for her father gets her to walk right in. Reminded of his own daughter, Sue smartly gets Laney to hide as part of a game before turning on Connor. Insisting that he is simply trying to move on in life with his daughter after her mother passed, Connor explains that Barbosa had issues when he fell for one of the club's dancers named Crystal. Such was his possessiveness that he took it out on Crystal while she was pregnant, which eventually resulted in her passing and Laney being born early. As it turns out, Amanda was the one who told Barbosa about the whole thing. Seeing Connor sincerely pleading on Laney's behalf, French suggests that they leave town and never look back. Despite it being against the way he works, Sue also agrees to let Connor go for Laney's sake. While leaving the building, however, he worries about how Tommy will react to their deed. They realize their troubles are more than just Tommy when they see Amanda in the lobby downstairs and learn that Barbosa had set them up. She also tells them that Barbosa was already at Connor's apartment, and that he planned to be done with him and then put the blame on the two of them. Thinking about what they can do to save the situation from exploding out of control, Sue and French take the stairs again to head back to Connor's apartment. To save Connor and Laney from a terrible fate, the two debt collectors begin their assault on Barbosa's armed men. Taking down two of them and arming themselves instead, they make their way further towards the apartment until they come across Alex. Knowing that French won't attack his friend, Sue shoots Alex, which gets Barbosa to quickly take cover. Once inside Connor's apartment, Sue and French ask him and Laney to take the fire escape to flee while they prepare for Barbosa's ambush. An intense gunfight ensues while Barbosa's team keeps increasing. When Sue gets repeatedly shot at, French retaliates at his attackers but is shot as well. While he promptly crawls to hide, Barbosa approaches Sue, who is struggling to breathe. An armed Tommy gets there just then with his weapon aimed right at Barbosa. Knowing very well that they were set up, he tells Barbosa that there had to be consequences for taking Sue down the way he did. Grateful for Sue through all the work they have done together, Tommy pulls the trigger as he thinks of it as the best response just as Connor and Laney escape before the police arrive on the scene. A while later, an injured French limps to the car in his situation and struggles with its key, enjoying each other's company elsewhere. Connor and Laney share a fun meal, all because two debt collectors decided to do the right thing. The Debt Collectors 2 opens at a bar one morning where Sue witnesses what could turn into a fight. The bar's owner reminds French, the employee responsible for the bar's security, to step in before things escalate. Getting into a battle of words, however, French is riled up so much that he ends up in the fight he was supposed to put an end to. As he steadily works his way through the opponents, Sue shouts out guidelines for his defense. While French is surprised to see Sue there, he uses his warnings to get rid of all the troublemakers. Hoping to have done a good job, French is disappointed when he gets fired instead. Joining Sue at the next-door diner then, he learns how his friend managed to hoodwink the end of his life, not just once but twice. Sue also tells him about their former boss Tommy helping him out in the aftermath. Asking about how French has been, Sue comes to know that he had managed to drive himself to the hospital despite being shot twice. Curious about his car then, Sue is shocked to learn that French sold it off for a meager $6,000. Confessing the real reason for his arrival then, Sue mentions a collecting job they could take up for Tommy. After their previous job together 7 months ago, Tommy had asked them to lay low since things went sideways. Back together again now, Sue tells him that their job is taking them to Vegas. On the way, Sue fills French in about Mal Reese, one of the rich and powerful targets they were after. Warning him about how dangerous she is, Sue mentions that once Mal was powerful enough, she had simply decided one day to be done with her family and had ruthlessly eliminated them. Having had a bit of history with her himself, Sue also says that he would like it if she isn't hurt by anything they do to get their job done. Finding it difficult to believe that they could hit 3 targets in 2 days without things getting dirty, French clarifies that they will both be equal partners for this job. Stopping for fuel a while later, French senses trouble when he notices an SUV pull over nearby. Surprised that the guys in the car not only know his name but are armed as well, French informs Sue about it. Calm as ever, Sue mentions being followed by them since they left LA. Puzzled by why anyone would want to ensure they are doing their job and not running off with the collection, French gets back on the road with Sue towards Vegas. At their destination, he notices Sue being a bit nervous before approaching Mal's club. Reminding his friend that they are working on a tight deadline, the two make their way in where they are advised by an assistant named Britt to get down to business immediately so as not to waste too much of Mal's precious time. When they finally meet Mal, she admits to having spoken to Tommy in advance about the $155,000 that she had borrowed earlier. While she says that she has the money ready, she also adds that she had thought that she would be let off the hook since the person she borrowed from has passed. Since Sue and French's presence at her establishment as debt collectors means that she will indeed have to pay the amount back, she tries to waste their time. Not willing to keep up with her attempts, French steps in to ask for the money she owes so they can get on their way. Trying to control the situation before it escalates, Sue reiterates that they've come a long way and would appreciate it if their work could get done without a hitch. Britt returns to the group and hands over a bag of cash to French before she films him checking the money. Mal then asks to speak to Sue privately while Britt continues to record French on his way out, so they have proof of handing over the money to him. Reminding Sue of the life he would have been living if he chose to stay with her, Mal then asks him to report back to his boss before dismissing him. Back on the road to their next target, Sue insists that something is wrong since the Mal he knew would never give up the money as easily as she did. Just then, another vehicle crashes into them before forcing them to pull over. From the vehicle, a bunch of armed security then accompany Britt as she demands that the money be returned. While the two friends contemplate among themselves as to who should tackle whom, they are then forced to get out of their car and face their opponents. While French takes on one of the armed guards, Britt attacks Sue with a bat. Unwilling to hit a woman, Sue simply defends himself. When Britt hits her mark, however, he strongly hits her back. Surrendering and letting them get away, she promises to get her revenge while French and Sue get back in the car to leave. The guys from earlier get there just then and discuss among themselves their speculation about who Sue is. They leave before French or Sue can make sense of anything they said, which gets French to worry about who they work for and what their objective is. Unwilling to drive back to LA right away, he then insists on checking into a motel to rest for the night before they can get to their next target. Washing up in his room later, Sue then calls Tommy to let him know that they got the money from Mal. In what seems to be an abduction situation, Tommy speaks to Sue through the speakerphone and isn't allowed to give him any information about the remaining clients. Mentioning that he hired the two guys to keep an eye on him and French to ensure that they don't run off with the money, Tommy then apologizes for getting them involved in this mess just as his phone is forcefully disconnected. When French comes over later, the conversation turns to Sue's ordeal and his narrow brush with his end. To French's surprise, Sue mentions having seen his young daughter Millie in his state. Considering Sue lost his daughter a while ago, he says it was a relief to see her smiling at him again. Before getting to his own room, French admits that he should have listened to Sue on the day they both got shot, as he now believes that things would certainly have turned out better. Glad about having his friend back with him, French then wishes him a good night. The next morning, the two head over to the City of Angels boxing club to wait for its owner and their second target, Esteban Madrid. With the task of collecting $95,000 from him, the two debt collectors get to the club where French gets into a bit of a tiff with the manager. Standing his ground, he demands to meet Mr. Madrid when the manager finally decides to oblige and leads them to the owner. Much like Mal, Mr. Madrid also mentions having spoken to Tommy about their arrival in advance. What is different, however, is the fact that Mr. Madrid insists that since the money went towards the sponsorship of one of the club's boxers named Sugar, it was never a loan, and hence he doesn't owe it to Tommy at all. When Sugar is informed about his sponsorship being in trouble, he confidently challenges Sue to a match. In the ring later, it initially seems like an equally matched duel, with Sue being able to hold his own. Gradually, though, he loses his steam and ends up on the receiving end of a volley of attacks. Unable to continue, Sue asks French to act as his substitute and face Sugar in his stead. Disregarding the rules of a fight as per Sue's advice, French goes all out on Sugar until he eventually manages to crack his wrist. While Sugar cries out in pain, the rest of the club members get into the ring to take French on. Meanwhile, an armed Mr. Madrid warns the debt collectors to leave his club. Sue takes him on and uses his weapon to subdue him as well as the rest of the club members. Taking over Sue again, French lets him demand the money from Mr. Madrid while he keeps the rest at bay. Hearing that the sponsorship money was gifted to the club by Barbosa intrigues Sue, but he grabs the bag of money and flees the place with French nonetheless. At a diner later, they go through their plan to get to their last target, Cyrus Skinner, from whom they are supposed to collect $255,000. Ivo and Darius, the two fellows on their tail, turn up just then as Sue asks French to remain calm in their presence. Unwilling to let go of his doubts, French asks them why they weren't collecting the debts instead of Sue and himself. Darius simply replies that Molly needed to know about every trouble the pair goes through to get him the money he is owed. On his way out then, he mentions that Molly's identity will be known soon enough. Asking French not to worry about it, Sue then heads over to call Tommy. Held at gunpoint, Tommy admits to knowing that their task was about collecting Barbosa's money for his brother Molly, who is known to be a notorious narcotics kingpin. Just as Tommy advises Sue to run away with the money, Molly takes over the conversation himself and informs Sue to bring in the final collection in return for his boss. Once the call is disconnected, Tommy thinks back to how Molly ambushed him at his club and had questioned him about French and Sue being responsible for his brother's end. While Tommy had earlier promised him that self-defense had resulted in Barbosa losing his life, and that French and Sue had ultimately lost their lives in a shootout, hearing about them being alive had compelled Molly to demand some answers. This is what had led Tommy to contact Sue and ask him to get French to join him and collect Barbosa's 3 remaining debts, as Molly cannot be directly associated with them. Meanwhile, French and Sue arrive at Cyrus Skinner's place. Once French arms himself, the two then walk into the garage together and demand to see Cyrus. Getting there himself just then, Cyrus mentions having spoken to Tommy about their arrival but clearly mentions his unwillingness to cooperate and pay any of the money. Irritated by his attitude, French aims the gun directly at Cyrus, who simply challenges him to pull the trigger. In a bid to stop French from doing the unthinkable, Sue steps in and repeatedly bashes Cyrus before trying to reason with him to hand the money over. Finally seeing sense, he asks his employee Knuckle to get the money. While French and Sue wait for him to get back, they soon realize that Knuckle is making a run for it. Leaving the gun with Sue, French then makes his way out as he pursues Knuckle. No matter how much he tries to keep up, however, French remains a few paces behind as he chases Knuckle down the street. Finally catching up to him, he promptly grabs the bag of money and gets back to Sue. French is counting the money when Cyrus overhears their conversation mentioning Molly. When he realizes that Molly has taken over Barbosa's debts, Cyrus warns the two of them about the massive trouble they are in. Unwilling to discuss things in his presence, however, Sue gets French outside and tries to assure him that he didn't know about any of this when he accepted the task for Tommy. Saying that he agreed to collect these 3 debts for Tommy's sake, he then adds that it was important enough for him to save Tommy's life. Explaining further, Sue adds that he is grateful for Tommy being around when he lost Millie to leukemia, followed by his wife. Despite Sue's emotions, French suggests running away with the money they've collected and sharing it between the two of them. When Sue refuses to let French get away, things among them escalate to a fight, despite Sue trying his best not to lose control. French continues to stubbornly mention going on his way with the money when Sue finally lets go and attacks him. With the stakes higher now, both have a go at each other with equal passion and strength, while not realizing that their fight has witnesses in the form of Darius and Evo. Repeatedly delivering punches and kicks to each other, Sue and French refuse to give the fight up. Watching them self-sabotage, Darius and Evo report back to Molly and are instructed to handle the mess. Realizing the danger they face when Darius aims his gun at them, Sue smartly manages to end him before using the gun to take Evo out as well. Warning Sue about what waits for him if he chooses to go back for Tommy, French decides to leave the money with him before getting on his way by himself. After some serious contemplation, Sue reaches Tommy's club that evening with his mind made up. Inside, even Tommy seems taken aback to see that Sue really came back for him. Molly, on the other hand, wonders why Sue turned up without his partner before mentioning that he didn't appreciate being lied to. Trying to strike a deal with Molly then, Sue offers all the bounty he collected with French in return for Tommy's freedom. When it is clear that Molly won't be making any such deal, Sue then pulls out the weapon he hid before and threatens Molly's assistant Felix's life. The tables are turned, however, when she pulls out a taser and knocks him out instead. Later, while Tommy and Sue are being hooked up for another stage of torture, Tommy bravely admits to being responsible for Barbosa's end. Finally hearing the confession he needed, Molly gets Felix to electrocute Sue just to make Tommy suffer. Injecting Sue with a shot of adrenaline, he is then revived just to be tortured yet again. However, before he can be hit again, French gets there and reveals that he brought Britt and her security guards with him for backup. Just as Tommy and Sue are untied, both sides open fire, during which Molly repeatedly shoots at Tommy. Brutally injured, Tommy asks Sue to take the money and run just before breathing his last. Joining the gunfight then, Sue takes Molly down just as French gets to his side and urges him to leave together. Leaving Felix and Britt to fight it out, French leads Sue outside where he informs him that he made a deal with Mal to save them. Reluctantly agreeing with his partner, Sue and French are driven away just as the police begin arriving on the scene. After Tommy's funeral, Sue informs French about going back to Vegas with Mal, before assuring him that he will always be there for him whenever he is needed. When French mentions a possible collection job on the East Coast, however, Sue opts out of it and says that he would rather spend his time with Mal. Seeing his friend's new car, however, he immediately changes his opinion and decides to join him as they happily get on their way together.